In my life right now, I feel more connected to the grand continuum of makers. Humans recently found in northern Turkey some 7,000-year-old boats that show signs on them of sophisticated towing and lifting technologies. I feel like if you could take a time machine and go back in time to the Egyptians, to the Middle Kingdoms, to the Levant, the surprising thing would be how familiar it all is. You'd be like, oh, that's a restaurant, that's a cafe, that's a hotel, this is a park.
That's not a virtual image. That's actually where you are,
no,
right?
This is truly my cave.
I have to hide my Peloton. I'm not promoting them. Sorry. I don't want to give them any more. I actually like my Peloton, much to Jesse's chagrin. But anyway.
Yeah.
Hi, Jesse.
How are you, Adam?
Good to see you, sir. I haven't seen you since South by Southlawn, I think.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Oh my gosh.
That was a long time ago.
Wait, that was a long time ago.
I got to build those letters. So, the SXSW.
Yeah.
And consequently, I got to drive a U-Haul van on the White House lawn. It was spectacular. Nice. The Secret Service told me I had 7 minutes, and I was like, okay. And then I thought, what are they going to do? Shoot me?
But I got to play with the dogs. Did you play with the dog when he came out?
No. You mean the president's dog?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I met the dog in the back hallways when we were filming there, but they didn't allow me anywhere near him.
Oh, no. The dog came out, and then also he himself came out, and Jesse sacrificed himself and knew that I wanted nothing more than just a photograph. And so
that's true.
You sacrificed yourself with your long, tall arm, and I got in there, and I have a handshake with the president that forever is in my house forever and ever. So thank you, Jesse.
Amazing.
Those were the days.
Have you been back to the White House since then, Adam?
I have. Actually, funnily enough, I was working on a book in, when the hell was it? Wait, Trump won in 2016, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I was working on a book, and I went back to the OSTP in April of 2016. And as I was going through the East Gate to go to the Eisenhower building, the Secret Service guys who I spent like 2 weeks at the very end of Obama's presidency in the Eisenhower building. So I knew those guys, and I saw them in April, and I was like, good to see you. I didn't expect to see you so soon. And they were like, yeah, we didn't expect to see you so soon either.
Yeah. And what was the mood like? Was it totally different being there? I mean, between the two?
Absolute fucking ghost town. Yeah. There was like 2 people left at OSTP. And like when I was there at 4 a.m. in December of 2015, and everyone was at their desks. My friend Kate was like, oh, I'm still trying to get food into Yemen using balloons because there's no international treaty that bans balloons for transpo.
Right. Wow. Were you always incredibly curious, Adam? Did it start with curiosity?
Yeah. And I grew up my dad was an artist and a polymath, got kicked out of a bunch of colleges, very smart, read all the time. So it was sort of the water I grew up swimming in.
Now, was science also the water?
I had a scientific bent, specifically because like the first teachers that I connected with were my art teachers and my science teachers.
Right.
And I had this amazing freshman year science teacher in high school named Dan Frere, who had just a wonderful way of explaining things. And he had this great description where he said, a glacier is basically a river, and it adheres to all the same fluid dynamics as a river, just really slowly. So a glacier is basically like a river on Quaaludes.
Wow.
And it's one of my favorite bits of science communication I've ever heard. And a few things he said to me in that freshman year earth science class stuck with me even until now as like remarkable things to hear as a young person and sort of map your model of the universe.
Yeah. And when you see kids now, do they, have that natural curiosity? Is it always trying to figure out the natural world?
Well, I mean, my mom's joke is that every child is a jailhouse lawyer, right? They're always trying to figure out how to thread the needle of existence. And I'll say, the kids that I interact with, by and large, yes, are super curious. I do a lot of cons. I go to pop culture conventions and take pictures and sign autographs. Obviously, the very self-selected crowd that comes to my autograph table is very much a spectrum-y crowd, very much an Asperger. I used to joke that Jamie and I were patron saints of the spectrum. And then I interviewed Temple Grandin and I realized that she's the Pope.
What was that actually like, interviewing her?
It was lovely. She's a remarkable being, right? Just getting to spend a couple of days with her was phenomenal. Her take on stuff is fascinating. And, when I'm interviewing, there's a show here in San Francisco called City Arts and Lectures, and I've done a few dozen interviews for them over the years. And I lean into it because it's not comfortable. It's not in my wheelhouse. And I like, pushing like that. And I'm always, when I'm considering an interview and I'm writing it out, I'm always looking for a sort of grand through line. I'm a narrativist, right? I want to tell the story. And I read Temple's books and I read interviews with her, and I was like, this is someone whose only goal is to alleviate suffering wherever she can find it. It's really, really beautiful. And I sort of waited until the 70% mark in our interview to drop this. Wow, it really seems like you've just spent your whole life to eliminate suffering. And she was like, yep.
Did you find that she had a different way of thinking? Because in a way, you guys are similar about experimenting and thinking about science, but it seems like she has a very unique point of view.
Her point of view is so deeply and it felt to me informed by empathy at the highest order.
Yeah.
Like she said, do you have a dog? And I said, yeah, we have a couple of dogs. And she says, you pet them back to front. They don't like the other way. You pet them front to back. They don't like the other way.
Yeah.
Like just going right to telling me how to pet my dogs, which I thought was beautiful.
Right.
Like just she's there connecting with the animal in the equation. She's connecting with each being in the equation when she considers an interaction.
Can I ask you a question about, actually, speaking of her, and she is extraordinary from everything I've read. Now the term neurodiversity, right, is a word, or people are more open-minded and we're excited about what different brains and the way different brains think. Are you finding that there is more acceptance?
An uncle of mine was a doctor working on left-handedness 20, 30 years ago.
That's neat.
And dyslexia. And I think dyslexia was everyone's gateway neurodivergence.
Yeah.
It was our culture's geteway neurodivergence. And even back then, I remember being a kid when my Uncle Larry was talking about this and talking about, there are many ways in which the fact that dyslexia gives you a non-standard viewpoint on a thing, that it gives you a unique vantage point. That was 35, 40 years ago. And I think that we're only leaning more into that idea now. In the neurodivergent community, I think there's also a sort of growing acceptance that the idea of neurodivergence is, someone once said in fractals, to call a branch of mathematics non-linear mathematics is like calling a branch of botany non-elephant animals.
Right.
We're all our own test case.
Yeah.
And I feel like the neurodivergent community is sort of at the forefront of also recognizing that. Like we're the amalgam of all of our coping mechanisms, plus all of the genetics that we've been saddled with, and the stories. And this is a side tangent, but I was talking to a famous actor who is a good friend, and I was asking him if he could do a gig with me, and he's like, I can't, I'm directing a thing. And I'm like, I didn't know you direct. And he paused and he said, Adam, I cobble together my living out of multiple streams. Right. And I was like, I love that sentence. It's exactly what we're all doing.
Yeah, exactly. Special effects. Did you start in special effects? Did you always have an idea of critical thinking? How did you get to special effects?
So Star Wars came out, I'm 57. Star Wars came out when I was 10. It hit me right up the middle. I saw it from the back seat of a Corolla at a drive-in, like the worst possible movie experience. And within days, I was reading Cinefantastique and Famous Monsters and realizing that people built this stuff. And it was, along with being a Lego designer, the first career I thought that I wanted to shoot for. And, I grew up, I went into Manhattan. I lived in New York in the late 80s. Worked for a couple of different special effects studios. And in each of these places, I found a work culture that wasn't welcoming to me. And it's plausible because I was way too green. But New York didn't pan out. I ended up moving out to San Francisco and getting into theater because San Francisco was just fat with small mini theater companies. I cut my teeth in a dozen black box theaters, and that actually got the attention of a commercial special effects company and brought me in. So it was like, at the end of anybody's life, the decisions they've made look linear at the vantage point from the end. But in the middle, it's all triage. It is.
Wait, you know what? I was in San Francisco then doing theater too. At Intersection, the Magic, were you doing it at all those places?
Intersection, Magic, Eureka Theater. I was a master
Eureka
for a couple of years. Project Artaud, I hand over handed in their rafters for days.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. I was there doing it.
I have one great missed opportunity from those. I built the set for a show at the Eureka called La Nonna, a big expensive set. And while I was building it, I was hearing the show that was the predecessor to ours. And it was playing for all day Saturday, all day Sunday to these raucous laughs from the audience. It was the original run of Angels in America.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I never saw it.
Wow.
I could hear them performing it, and I knew Lisa Bruneau who started it, but I never got to see it. It was a really dumb lapse in my attention.
And then how did you get from there to Star Wars, and what did it feel like to walk onto the Star Wars set?
Well, heaven, absolute heaven. So I found myself working for Jamie Heineman in commercial special effects. And after about 6 or 8 months of doing that, I had this really specific experience in that I realized, I am working until 6, going home, having dinner, and I'm going to bed. And this is new because when I was working in theaters, I would put in a full day, come home to my shop and work all night. And, in your 20s, you only need to sleep every third day. So I was taking advantage of that. And after about 6 months working for Jamie, I noticed I wasn't working on any of my personal aesthetic work. And I investigated that and I realized, it's actually that the creative problem solving I'm doing in service of this commercial special effects is feeding that creative bent of mine. And I thought, I guess this is what it means to have a career. Like my aesthetics dovetail well with this commerce-based idea. And I spent about 5-6 years working for Jamie on over 200 commercials. I sculpted so many Hershey's Kisses.
Right.
I did lots of stop motion animated stuff. And then in the late 90s, I didn't want to work for Jamie anymore. I wanted to think about a bigger picture. And a lot of my friends were working on Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
Right.
At that point, I'd had enough time in the industry and I'd worked with enough people that I just sort of pestered the shop lead at ILM for about 4 months until he hired me. And it was like I had reached a stage in my career where I was confident enough. I knew that would work out. And I got up there and found to my delight that I had all the skills that I needed, right? Like I showed up and I could paint, I could do electronics, I could do rigging, I knew how to talk to art directors. And within a few months, I was doing all of that there. It was kind of a lovely expansion of my skill set. And so I say that I went to high school in Jamie's shop. I went to college at ILM, and Mythbusters was my grad degree.
Do you ever look at technologies and wonder, like, do you ever look back at like Egypt's technology and go, geez, how did they do that? Like, how would you create something like that? Because there's so much precision in that work. They supposedly did everything with a chisel and a rolling pin or something,
Yeah.
You have statues that are sculpted to just incredible precision.
Indeed. Obsidian blades in Mexico City ground to a submicron edge.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think about all that?
I love that question because at 57, I feel more in my life right now. I feel more connected to the grand continuum of makers. Right? Like there's a wonderful YouTube channel I follow called ClickSpring, and it's this young man in Australia who's been slowly building the Antikythera mechanism from scratch.
Right.
Using all the CT scans and doing it totally accurately. But what it really calls out is the Antikythera mechanism is not a one-off. It's the result of a mature process by a shop that knew how to manufacture and maintain these machines. And it just happens to be the only one that we found. Humans recently found in northern Turkey some 7,000-year-old boats that show signs on them of sophisticated towing and lifting technologies. I feel like if you could take a time machine and go back in time to the Egyptians, to the Middle Kingdoms, to the Levant, I feel like we'd all be shocked by how precise humans have been for a long time.
With the Egyptian ones, and it's true sort of around the world, that the earlier pyramids are much more precise than the later pyramids. It's if a fog came over the people and they forgot how to make the things, It's a perplexing question,
But I'm also curious about, it could also be that culturally different things became important, like the speed of getting something done. I think in New York City, there are buildings, like you look at the difference between the Chrysler building and some brutalist horror show, and people could ask the same exact questions about those two. Like, why, if they knew how to build buildings like this in the 40s, why did they waste the 70s building all this fucking horror shows?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, actually, because it's like, you go to Scotland and Edinburgh, those buildings are built out of stone, and they're, the only thing you can change is a doorway, and you drive 5 miles away, and it's just all the normal crap that people build. It's a set of rules have changed what could happen. I wonder what influence that has on history,
Well, my friend Adam Rogers wrote a book about the history of color and humans' interaction with it, and as part of the book, he found this cave in Africa where it had a natural ochre deposit. So they used it for ochre and iron oxide for ceremonial purposes. But because they can go down through the sedimentary layers of the cave's use and they can see evidence of manufacturing, they can tell that this cave was in regular use as a color production facility for over 5,000 years.
Amazing.
And that was like 8,000 years ago. So I think about the idea of this semi-permanent facility 8,000 years ago. I feel like we can't even conceive of, I keep thinking that if you could take a time machine and go back, the surprising thing would be how familiar it all is. You'd be like, oh, that's a restaurant, that's a cafe, that's a hotel, this is a park.
A few years ago, there were so many more maker studios around. You just sort of thought that would take over everything. Do you see it? Are we still progressing with makers, and, is it still as strong as it was?
It certainly might be undergoing some hiccups. I do feel like, on balance, the maker movement is still really ascendant. We're at this stage with 3D printing where in the last couple of years, it really has done this sort of sea shift to being more like a kitchen appliance than a DIY modding tool. The prints that I can get out of my printer on its bog standard settings astound me as a maker. And I'm just finally starting to make objects with rapid prototyping tools that feel to me as compelling as objects I could build.
Let's say 3D printing, where does that come in? I mean, do those things, are they affecting things now?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think 3D printing is democratizing making in a spectacular way. It's also radically increasing the intersection of fandom in different franchises. And I think that's really lovely to witness. I think the big holdup still is CAD/CAM. The software for making 3D drawings is still shite. And it's still really hard to take something that's in your head here and put it here. Like, I go out and I look for drawings to print and I see the drawings people are drawing, and by and large, they're overly simplistic.
AI can design 1,000 amazing looking chairs in however long it takes to do the prompt, but it can't select which one is the best one. So everything right now is all conversations about AI, but it still doesn't do the job of choosing, or does it?
No, I think you've alighted on exactly what I think is the most interesting part, which is the point of view. That's the phrase I'm using for what anyone else might call aesthetic or creativity. I think it all comes down to just your vantage point on being a person in the execution of the work that you're doing. The more honest and in touch with that you are, I feel like it's axiomatic, the more resonant and reflective that piece is going to be to me as the viewer. And I've yet to see anything from AI that feels to me like it has anything approaching an actual point of view on the subject matter.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it seems like a more advanced calculator. It can mirror human thought, but it's really just a mirror. It isn't a tool yet unto its own. Maybe it'll develop that, but it doesn't seem like it's there.
Yet is the operative thing. I guess that's the big debate, right? We don't know how it will adopt a point of view, or if it is a thing itself, right?
The first time I went to San Diego Comic-Con, the costume that shifted me on my axis was seeing a Hello Kitty pink Darth Vader that was 7 feet tall. And specifically the cosplay mashups are where I find some of the most joy in the hobby that I love, which is putting on costumes and wearing them. And it betrays such a really, like, I can see AI doing a Hello Kitty Darth Vader, but I can't see it approximating the love that brings about that decision.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's what's so amazing about human beings is that we can interrogate our experience and write a song or a poem or make a dress or do a podcast that is transcendent because we've been honest about that experience. I think that's so remarkable.
You've been doing these things for such a long time now. Have you found community when you go to Comic-Con? Are those a like-minded tribe?
100%. A friend of mine was watching my Instagram feed of all these pictures I was taking with fans in costume, and she said, "How often do you think the costume is their kink?" And I said, "It's a funny question, but that's not at all what's going on here. People with kinks, they have their track, they know their hobby, they're good. They can take care of themselves. What's going on at these cons is it's a journey of self-discovery. I know for me, cosplaying is about putting my body into a narrative that meant something to me and feeling what it feels like a little bit from inside the bubble of that narrative and exploring what it is about me that I feel intersects with that character. And I love that conversation. People bring up their executions. Sometimes they're very primitive and sometimes they're super advanced, but the conversations are always the same. And it's just about like exulting at the path they've taken to get here. But yeah, I do find a deeply simpatico community among cosplayers and makers. And like one of the universal axioms of cosplay is that it's not comfortable. Every costume is a little bit, it's going to take a little bit out of you. You're going to sweat a bit. It's going to be, it's going to catch a bit. And there's an aspect of that, like going to a con and wearing a costume. This is not easy and it's not comfortable. And that's sort of part of the whole experience.
Yeah.
It's like in any art form, right? There's a little bit of dues paying.
Yeah. Corporations, do they limit our ability to repair things and change things? And does it become a limitation on our creativity in some way?
It absolutely does. Late stage capitalism is the biggest enemy of creativity I think that there can be. All of my rants end in late stage capitalism rants. So that's the...
Yeah.
Can you explain that further, like for our audience? Like, why does it all ladder up to that?
Well, because Milton Glaser, famous graphic designer Milton Glaser, had this wonderful speech he gave on YouTube about 15 years ago, where he pointed out, he's like, if you do anything that gets attention, that's great. People get excited about it. You do the thing they get excited about. Someone starts to pay you to do it. And then all of a sudden, everybody only wants you to do the thing, that thing that got you that first attention. And he said, as an artist, it is your responsibility to abandon that thing as fast as you can and move on to the next thing.
Yeah, great.
Commerce doesn't ever want to do that. Commerce wants, it's funny, right? The Buddhist frame is that like we all want to be comforted. We all want to know that we will be safe. And there's no such thing as either, right? We are not safe. We will not find comfort. It's a brutal 75 years here and then we're done. But commerce also wants to be comforted. It wants to know that there's this ridiculous constant stream of money coming in. And I think that Cory Doctorow from Boing Boing has done some wonderful work in giving us cultural language for that. He calls it enshittification. He says the first thing the company does, like Google, they provide a really valuable service for their customer base. And we all love it for a long time. Once we're all locked in, they bring in the advertisers. Then once the advertisers are locked in, they start rent seeking from us. Then once we've paid, they start rent seeking from the advertisers. Then once the and then they actually saddle it up with debt, sell it off to some hedge fund, and it slowly dies like Toys R Us.
Yeah. All these technologies that we have now, they're not reaching everybody, at least yet. You see glimmers of communities, Fab Lab, where you have people around the world kind of coming up with designs and maybe sharing the designs, but it's still a pretty specialized group that gets that. It doesn't reach everybody. Do you think we need to do that faster, or do we have a responsibility to get some of these tools? I can think of many rural communities around the world that would do really well if they had these tools.
You're right. No, you're absolutely right. White kids, by and large, have much greater access to maker labs than most other folks. And as William Gibson wrote, I think in 1983, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Right.
It is vital. You know, I sat on the board of a maker organization called Nation of Makers, and our goal was to help maker spaces develop and follow and share best practices for community engagement and building a viable nonprofit model. And one of the places that we thought was potentially the most fruitful to go towards would be Boys and Girls Clubs. They are all over the place. Libraries are actually a fantastic front line for maker labs. Libraries were among the very earliest adopters. In fact, I know that the lead librarian in the Cleveland Public Library, I think, built one of the first maker spaces in the country. And Cleveland has one of my favorite maker spaces. They have ThinkBox, which is Case Western's 7-story, $50 million makerspace. And the whole goal with their makerspace was to have the lowest possible threshold to entry. They want somebody random off the street to be able to walk in and be laser cutting within minutes. And this is a very common ethos among new makerspaces, is to have a very low threshold to entry. And I feel like that just fills me with joy to know that that's the frame people are building makerspaces with.
You know, what do you think the purpose of technology is in general? You know, I mean, I always frame it as, you know, the purpose of technology is to empower human beings, but and there is no other purpose. But what do you think it is?
Well, so I'm going to quote this thing I had in my notebook for years. Max Frisch said, this is like from the 80s, technology is the knack of so arranging the world so that we don't have to experience it.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think that humans do a couple of things. I think we explore because we're curious animals, and we talk about what we have explored, and we do that using narrative. I think that art and science are just two different executions of narrative. They are the same process with the same amount of rigor, just in different planes. And I think that technology works when it helps humans explore and tell each other stories about what they're finding when they explore.
Now, how did you become a storyteller? Because you're doing all these other things, you're at the theater, you're, you know, doing special effects, but how did you then become and decide to be a storyteller?
It's funny. I realized it almost by accident. Somewhere after I'd been at ILM for a couple of years, I realized that everything I had ever done for a living had been a version of storytelling. Like when I'm gluing little bits onto the side of a spaceship, they won't aesthetically work unless I know as the modeler why they're there. It doesn't have to be a highly specific reason, but there has to be a logic to me for it to resonate. And I realized that was a form of narrative. And further, we love the director culture here in the US, and the director is the king god of the thing, and he is the primary storyteller. But the real fact is that everyone on a film crew is a storyteller all the way down, and the film won't work unless they're all invested in the story that they're telling.
At ILM, there were so many amazing storytellers there. There were so many amazing artisans and just thinkers there. What was the experience of going in there? Was it what you thought it would be? Was there things you learned there that were unusual?
Yes, there were lots of things I learned that were unusual. And it was, if anything, ILM was way better than I imagined it could be when I first thought about going there. Because what I found when I worked there immediately was a deeply sharing collaboration culture, where if I was executing some model on my desk and I was using a novel technique to do it, my colleague Lauren Peterson, one of the original ILM model makers, would walk by and be, oh, what are you doing? How does that work? And I'd show him and he'd be like, oh, that's so cool. And then he'd go away. And then for the rest of the day, all sorts of other folks would file past my desk. I heard you were working on something cool. Tell me about it. And it was really to build and spread the institutional knowledge of solving these weird problems we had to solve. And there's this wonderful documentary on Disney Plus called Light and Magic about the founding of George Lucas's special effects company. And in it, in the first couple of episodes, there's this whole story about how John Dykstra, one of the special effects legends, invents and designs and builds the motion control camera, the soul of special effects photography, And he does all of this on a single movie while working on Star Wars. And I'm watching him do it, and I'm thinking, this is such an incredible mind that built this. But I can also tell that I feel like he might be a difficult supervisor. I'm watching him do interviews, and I'm like, I bet this guy might punch down. I'm just thinking to myself, hey, he strikes me as like he might be difficult to work for. And then George Lucas, despite the incredible success he has on Star Wars, and I'm also amazed that Coppola did this, decides to screw LA, he's going to move north. And when he moves north, he doesn't bring Dykstra with him. And I feel like that is this really key decision that informed the community I found 20 years later when I showed up. That George was selecting for people that were easy to work and collaborate with, because that's all I ever encountered at ILM, was people who were easy to collaborate with. And it wasn't until I watched Light and Magic that the flag tipped in my brain that was George was selecting for that.
And was George walking around the building? Did you interact with him?
No, he wasn't walking around the building. He did show up at the parties and was very gracious, would talk to everybody. It didn't look like he was having fun, but that's totally fine. He was gracious in that regard.
Now, if you thought about a technology that hasn't been invented yet, what would be the technology you would, if you could pull something from 20 years from now back to now, what would you pull?
The Babel fish. I want to be able to understand and speak to everybody in every language in the world. Being a polyglot is my number one superpower I would choose if I found a genie.
Do you speak many languages?
I don't. I speak only English.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
My ambition knows every bound.
Yeah, but they come up with something every couple of years where they seem like they're going to be able to do that. I think it's going to take a while,
Well, we're also trying to understand what whales are saying, and that's also really exciting, except I don't imagine that we're going to like what they have to say.
Well, exactly. That seems like a good application of AI. I think they're doing that down in the Gulf of Mexico, where they're trying to discern the clicks, what they mean,
Oh, yeah. They've now got a syntax. They've got diphthongs. Animal language acquisition is my favorite execution for AI. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting because in a way, before we can understand the language, you have to understand that they're living in a totally different environment, and the environment is going to dictate certain things that we can't even necessarily understand what they're talking about,
And this might be the very first time we get to that point of like, what is it like to be a blank? There are these moments when my dog and I understand so precisely what each other is thinking.
Yeah.
And the world feels so much smaller when those moments happen. It feels so beautiful to have that moment with a sentient being that's not in my species.
Yeah. Although, you can never know what your dog dreams about. It's sitting down there kicking and we assume that it's running, but it might be, doing, large language models. And
he's like scratching his way through my bowels, right?
Yes. Jesse's wanting to invent this Neuralink for dogs, by the way. So he's got a whole idea about this.
If you're anything like me, you wish you could talk to your dog. I tried everything. American Sign Language, a series of barks and growls, French Sign Language, but nothing worked. Now there's a better way. Neuropaw. With Neuropaw's FDA approval pending technology, you can finally hear and understand exactly what your dog is thinking. Experience the joy of knowing your dog's thoughts and feelings, and the peace of mind that comes from truly understanding their needs. Every thought from, I love you, to, I'm hungry, to, why am I alive, will be beamed directly into your prefrontal cortex, every pet owner's dream. Ask your vet if Neuropaw is right for you. Stop using Neuropaw immediately if you begin exhibiting dog-like behavior or develop brain mange. So what are you waiting for? Head to neuropaw.com and use promo code BARK for 20% off your first chip implant.
Because we all want to know what our dogs are thinking. We think we know.
There's a researcher who has trained a whole bunch of dogs, dozens of them now, to stay still for fMRI scans.
Oh, wow.
And one of the first things they discovered was that when the dog smells, hears, or sees its owners, the parts of its brain that lights up is the same that lights up for us when we see our partners. That it's like the dogs have all the emotional richness that dog owners always knew that their brains possessed, despite the naysayers' complaints.
Any research on the cats yet, or no?
I don't know. Not that I know of, but can you imagine getting a cat to sit still for 40 minutes in an episode?
No. No.
But, you see there are those, you see parrots that have incredible, I forget, we did an interview with a woman who had researched her parrot for 20 years and loved the parrot and thought of the parrot as her best friend. And then the parrot caught a cold and died. And it was, it was supposed to be a research subject. And she just sat there sobbing because she realized that it was one of the most significant relationships in her life,
Yeah.
You always see these things where these connections can be made across species, but it is incredibly difficult,
I did just see a thing that despite some 4 decades of doing sign language with great apes, not a single test subject has ever asked a question.
Wow.
The sign language apes, none of them has ever asked a single question. I think that's really significant.
I mean, do you think there are traits that make us human? Is it sometimes it's physics and maybe music, certain kinds of music, but it seems like every time we make a limitation on what we think it is, we keep raising the bar because there's some animal somewhere that does something similar. Maybe not exploring physics, but
I'm getting to the age where I think everything is sentient. I think that must be the case. In quantum physics, we're more and more discovering that each of us is a universe into ourselves, where physics is non-local. We are all creating our own little gravity wells. And this is the same thing the Buddhists have been saying for thousands of years, that consciousness is a oneness and we are spikes on its graph. And that sounds like a very sensible interpretation of the available data to me.
Yeah.
And I think that, we have these senses. There's more than 5, but we have these senses we see and parse the world through. And to a neutrino, Earth doesn't barely exist. It is like a sometimes cloud to a neutrino. So none of this exists to a neutrino. And yet they might be part of some body or some colony or some organism that we can't conceive of. It's also, there's some researchers who did this wonderful thing in Africa where they poured concrete into a termite mound and then excavated it. So you could see the structure of a full-blown termite mound. And there's air conditioning and convection currents, and there's garbage scows, and there's collection, and there's recycling, and there's morgues and crematoria practically. It's spectacular. And I look at that and I look at a modern city and I'm like, we're ants. We are both colonies of entities, 99% of the cells in my body are non-human, and we are part of a colony. So I'm getting more and more into thinking that consciousness exists on a whole bunch of different levels.
With neutrinos, they're so hard to study. Me and Priscilla went down in the mine in South Dakota, I think, where it's where they're building the neutrino detector, and it's such a incredible experience going. It's a mile down in the earth. It's supposedly the quietest place on earth, and you trudge along, and you're walking through a tunnel, and it's totally pitch black, and you come across a miner that looks like he's from 100 years ago, and then you go into the next space, and it's totally empty, and you have to change into
you get in the equipment, and then suddenly you open the door and you're in another universe where they're preserving that sanctity of being there.
Yeah.
It's quite extraordinary what they're doing. They're trying to send those neutrinos back and forth. It was through Fermilab, right?
They're trying to understand what they are, why they change, what it means when they change. And people always think that science is about understanding everything perfectly, but the thing that makes science different is that you're always looking for a new model to replace the old model. It constantly is trying to move forward and give us a better understanding of what the world we live in is. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And again, commerce loves to say things are this way or that way. And every scientist knows that the closer you look at anything, the blurrier it gets. And it is a natural, again, I think it's also a natural human inclination to want to know something, to want to know what something is. And every last definition we have for anything in our lives is nothing but a sort of gross approximation of reality.
Feynman would say, we're up against mysteries. Every which direction we look, there's mysteries all around us. And it certainly feels like that to me. I have trouble understanding what's going on most of the time anyways, but I do think that we still have a long way to go to understand this universe we're living in,
Well, and Feynman's one of my all-time heroes, really, in terms of his outlook. And he has this wonderful thing he says, in one lecture about quantum physics is he says, I'm about to tell you some stuff, and the whole time I'm telling it to you, you're going to think to yourself, how can it be that way? And he said, which is a totally reasonable thing to ask yourself, except that it comes from this utterly vain attempt to compare what I'm telling you to something that you know. And that is not possible. And I loved him bringing vanity into that. It is totally true. It is a vain attempt at parsing why this is the way that it is.
He has that beautiful analogy about the bird. You know, you can know all the details of the bird, like how it looks, what's its shape, but you'll know nothing about the bird if you don't really try and look inside, you know?
Yeah. He also was a good friend of my friend James Randi. And apparently they had a regular thing that they would do when they would get together is that Randi would do a magic trick for Feynman. And then a couple days later, Feynman would call him up and tell him how it was done.
Right. He loved magic, that's for sure.
Julia Sweeney has this funny joke where she says, hey, look, magic is all we atheists have left.
Yeah, exactly.
I know I don't say atheist anymore because I don't like defining it in terms of theism. I call myself a New Testament agnostic. I can't know, and I agree with Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Most of Jesus.
Thank you, Adam. This was great. I really appreciate you doing this.
Oh, Jesse, Priscilla, this is my favorite conversation. It's the only conversation.
Well, I'm trying to put together what I'm thinking about you, where you are right now in your life, and everything you're talking about is about the need for connection and collaboration, and let's go away from the things that's how I'm seeing everything. That's the way I'm looking at this conversation. We want to connect. I mean, we want
to connect. And there's a lot of cultural talk about finding your own point of view. And as a parent of adult children now, my boys are 25, they're twins. The loveliest frame about having adult kids is how much it's not about me and how little I matter. I'm here to see them where they are until I'm gone. And then they've got to do their thing, but it really is about what their journey is. And it's lovely to seed. It's lovely to feel on the back nine of this golf course. That's all.
Yeah, well, I'm with you there. Jesse and I, we have some adult kids too. So yeah. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Adam.
Yeah, thank you, Adam.